Well, very welcome to this seminar about the EU taxonomy. Looking forward to this discussion. I'm CEO at 2050. I will introduce that in just a minute. We will have a great discussion here and a lot of information about EU taxonomy. There's been quite much in the debate and getting more and more relevant. So we have three very celebrated speakers today that will introduce it and give it more facts and see what's next, what can we expect. First, we have Nathan Fabian, Chair of the EU Commission Platform on Sustainable Finance, also Chief Responsible Investment Officer in Principles of Responsible Investment. And that is a group of over 3,500 institutional investors committed to working on environment, social and governance issues. So he's been very involved. And then we have Carl-Oskar Holming, member of the Platform on Sustainable Finance and Head of Sustainability Strategy, Policy and Governance as the Swedish bank SEB. He's also been quite involved. And then I have my colleague, Matilda Persson, working with me here at 2050 Consulting, also been involved in one of the groups, sustainable finance expert with 13 years within the sustainability field. Also worked in this TEG group that you have to explain, Matilda, for everyone, what that is, developing the taxonomy, but I know you will. And I would like to say, so that you know, we are recording this seminar, so we'll send it out. So if you want to ask a question, be aware. We will collect questions through the questions Q&A section that you find below. So please start when you've already know about relevant questions. And please use Twitter, because this is important and this is an important step towards a greener future. We have a hashtag down there, EU Taxonomy 2050, easy to remember. And please take the next slide about, I will take 30 seconds around 2050. We have our vision is prosperous business on a planet in balance. And that fits very well into the Green Deal from EU and the taxonomy. So that's why we like it so much. We energize the companies and try to do it within the planetary borders. And we see no differences between prosperous business and working within the planet. And that's great to see that EU now takes important steps to direct the money, because that's where the action comes. And we want to do it fast forward to a greener future. And that is great to see EU have the same definition as us on greener. That means both prosperous from an economical, ecological, and of course, social perspective as well. But please, Matilda, take it away. What is the taxonomy?
Thank you very much, Marcus. And thank you all for being here today. It's really nice to see so many of you here today, and also from different parts of the public and the private sector. And I think that's a really strong sign of the impact that the taxonomy already had in regards to facilitating discussions on sustainability. I'll start off with a brief introduction. I know that a lot of you are already familiar with this, but I want to make sure that those of you who have not yet entered the beautiful world of the taxonomy are introduced to it. And let's start with the higher purpose and the bigger picture. In order to meet the EU's climate and energy targets and reach the objectives of the EU Green Deal that we see here in front of us, it's fundamental to direct investments towards sustainable projects and activities. We also need to make sure that investments support a resilient economy and a sustainable recovery from this pandemic we're in. We have a great opportunity to build back our economies better, stronger, more resilient, and more sustainable. And just to remind ourselves in regards to climate targets, this orange line is the path we need to be on in order to reach net zero carbon emissions 2050. It's a steep path of emissions reductions, and we need our economic activities and investments to be in line with this path and transition to net zero. This gray line here is the baseline. The OECD estimates that globally 6.35 trillion euro a year will be required to meet the Paris Agreement goals by 2030. Public sector resources will not be adequate to meet this challenge, and mobilization of public and private capital will be necessary. But to where do we steer the capital to reach our objectives and targets? How can we identify which investments and activities will take us on the right path and reach our targets? In order to define this, a common language and a clear definition of what a sustainable investment actually is needed. This is why the EU taxonomy has been created. So the EU taxonomy is a unified classification system defining which economic activities can be considered sustainable. The reason why we need this is because different definitions of sustainable activities and taxonomies among member states and institutions, for example, has hampered sustainable investments. And at the same time, lack of transparency and definitions on sustainability has implied higher costs for the real economy to raise capital for sustainable solutions, and it has complicated for investors to check and compare sustainability information. In order to reorient capital flows in a sustainable direction, and a common language is needed for investors, issuers, policymakers, regulators, etc. This will avoid greenwashing. It will be easier for the real economy to raise capital for sustainable activities. We'll have less market fragmentation, and the EU taxonomy can also be a basis for further policy action or standards. The taxonomy is based on 6 environmental objectives. It's climate change mitigation, climate change adaptation, the sustainable use and protection of water and marine resources, the transition to a circular economy, pollution prevention and control, and protection and restoration of biodiversity and ecosystems. And as I said earlier, the taxonomy defines which economic activities are environmentally sustainable. There are 3 main criteria for when it can be considered sustainable. First of all, the activity should contribute substantially to at least one of the 6 environmental objectives. At the same time, it shouldn't do any significant harm to the other 5 environmental objectives. Now, how do we know if it contributes substantially and that it doesn't do any harm to the other objectives? This is specified in the delegated acts adopted by the Commission. The delegated act has for each specific economic activity specific technical screening criteria for when the activity contributes substantially and doesn't do any significant harm. The Commission has so far published a draft delegated act for these 2 environmental objectives. The activity should also comply with minimum safeguards, and these are the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises and the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. The assessment of an activity is binary. Either the activity is sustainable or not, that is, it can meet these criteria. However, when you look at a company or a fund, for example, you look at the percentage of the activities or investments that are aligned with the taxonomy that can meet these criteria. So who needs to report on how taxonomy aligned they are? First of all, it's the financial market participants offering financial products in the EU. And then we have the large public interest companies with more than 500 employees. These are the companies, banks, and insurance companies that have to report according to the non-financial statement under the Non-Financial Reporting Directive. Also, EU and member states have to consider the taxonomy when setting public measures, standards, or labels for green financial products, and this includes the EU Green Bond Standard, which is on its way. However, we know that the taxonomy will affect many more organizations than those that have to disclose their alignment. The taxonomy can, for example, be used on a voluntary basis by credit institutions and other issuers such as local authorities. You might have to report because you're in the reporting chain. SMEs might want to report in order to attract green investments. And we've already seen a lot of creative use of the taxonomy by organizations in order to make strategic decisions and steer them in a sustainable direction. And this is beyond the disclosure obligations. These are the sectors that are today covered by the taxonomy under the climate change mitigation objective. They have been selected as they are high emitting macro sectors and account for more than 94% of the emissions in Europe. But they are also sectors with activities which can enable emission reductions in other sectors or activities. There are three type of activities under the climate change mitigation objective. We have the activities that are already low carbon and are already compatible with the 2050 net zero carbon economy. The technical screening criteria, that is the threshold for when they are considered to substantially contribute to climate change mitigation, is likely to be stable and long term, and it will be reviewed at least every 5 years. Examples of this is renewable energy, for example, wind power. Then we have the activities that contribute to a transition to a net emission economy in 2050, but are not currently operating at that level. These technical screening criteria for these activities is likely to be revised regularly and tightened over time, and they will be reviewed at least every third year. Example of this is in manufacturing cement and building renovations. And then we have the third type of activity, which is those activities that enable emission reductions in the activities above. The technical screening criteria for them will be consistent with those activities being enabled. An example of this is manufacturing of wind turbines. Looking at climate change adaptation, we have two types of activities which substantially contribute. It's the adapted economic activity, where the activity itself has adopted measures to reduce all material physical climate risks. The technical screening criteria that determine whether an economic activity makes a substantial contribution to climate change adaptation can actually be applied to any economic activity. What's important to remember is that it should at the same time not do any significant harm to the other environmental objectives. And you can find the criteria on this in the Delegated Act. Then there's the economic activity enabling adaptation in other sectors or activities. And this can, for example, be non-life insurance or weather observation. So what do we have ahead? According to the original timeline, the first delegated act setting the technical screening criteria was supposed to be adopted by the end of last year, but this is not in place yet. What's not on this timeline is the IT tool that the Commission will launch soon to help us navigate in the taxonomy, and I think that's really appreciated by many of us. By 1st of June latest, the Commission will adopt a delegated act setting out the content, presentation, and methodologies for complying with the disclosure requirements. And by the end of this year, financial market participants will be required to complete their first set of disclosures against the taxonomy, covering activities that substantially contribute to climate change mitigation and/or adaptation. Companies will be required to disclose in the course of 2022, and this will cover the financial year of 2021. By the end of the year, the Commission will also adopt a delegated act for the 4 remaining environmental objectives. They will also publish a report on how the taxonomy could include social objectives and the possibility to extending the taxonomy to include performance criteria for activities which are significantly harmful to the environment. This is the so-called brown taxonomy. By the end of next year, financial market participants will be required to complete their disclosures covering the 4 remaining environmental objectives. Companies will be required to disclose in the course of 2023, and this will cover the financial year of 2022. So this was just a brief introduction, and we'll now go deeper into the implementation and future taxonomy with Nathan Fabian. Hi, Nathan. So good to talk to you.
Hi, Matilda. It's great to see you too.
Yeah. Thank you very much for joining us here today. We really appreciate it. And you're the chair of the Platform on Sustainable Finance. Could you please tell us a little bit more what the platform, what you do, and also who are the members of the platform?
Yes, I'd be delighted. And it was good to hear you giving the overview, Matilda, reflecting on all of that work that you did in the technical expert group. So thanks for the invitation today, and hello to everyone listening. So the platform is an expert group of the European Commission. It's established now as a permanent institution in the EU financial regulatory framework under the taxonomy regulation. And its job is to provide recommendations to the European Commission, but also by virtue of being an expert group, we hope to provide confidence to markets about the environmental integrity of the taxonomy criteria. That's quite important, remembering that the purpose of the taxonomy is for people to have some confidence and trust in what the market calls green and sustainable. So it's a very large group, much bigger than the technical expert group that we worked on together, Matilda. It has around 60 members. So we have 18 business and industry groups. We have 12 civil society NGOs. We have 5 think tanks. We have 6 financial industry organizations, including SEB, and my colleague Carl Oscar will speak soon. We have 9 individuals, experts in their fields, and we have directly appointed institutions like the International Network for Greening the Financial System and the OECD. And of course, we have directly appointed members who are European institutions like the supervisory authorities of the financial markets, the European Investment Bank, and more. And of course, well, we should never forget, of course, the European Environment Agency as well. So it's a very large, very substantial group with many, many experts on it. Our jobs are to provide recommendations on taxonomy criteria, to provide recommendations on the implementation of the taxonomy in practice, mainly around data and user experiences. In future, we hope to monitor the flows of finance and investments that are taxonomy aligned. And we also have this additional wider role to advise on future sustainable finance policy. And I think that's recognizing that the taxonomy is very important, but it's really just the start of what is a very substantial shift in capital markets. This idea of bringing sustainability goals and financial market function together in clear regulation, clear tools, a clear expectation that private finance is aligned to our environmental and social goals. This is a new step, as we've always treated it as something that was optional and may be done for risk purposes. But now we're realizing that there's such urgency that we must take deliberate and intentional steps. And so the taxonomy has a broader role to advise the Commission as well. Shall I pause there? And
exciting. And as I mentioned in my introduction, that the first delegated act has not yet been adopted. And so I was wondering if you could provide, tell us something about the status and give us some insight of when it can be adopted. I know a lot of people are anxiously waiting.
Indeed, we all are. So the first delegated act, so everyone knows, is on climate mitigation and climate adaptation. So 2 of the 6 environmental objectives, including the do no significant harm criteria for the non-climate objectives. And such was the interest in these criteria and the delegated act that there were over 46,000 responses in the consultation. Now, around 2,000 of those were unique, substantial and independent contributions, and the rest were part of a broader community campaign. But again, submissions by individuals making comments on the criteria, and really most of those 44,000 endorsed the work of the technical expert group and the recommendations there. And the reason that they did was because they felt those recommendations were well researched, they were objective, and they were science and evidence based. Now, I'm not saying the TEG got everything perfectly right. I don't think that would be right to say, but this is the recognition of the substance of that work is what inspired so many responses from the public. And I think that's really quite important. But even the rest of the submissions, the 2,000, that requires a lot of work. Because as you know, Matilda, we're talking around dozens and dozens of criteria to review, each of them very technical in their own right. And so the Commission simply needed more time to conduct this review and to ensure that member states and members of the European Parliament had some time to process this information. And I think that's why we've seen some more time. And I think that's a sensible thing for the Commission to do. In terms of what's happening now, there is this deep review is going on of the criteria. And you may be aware that there was an additional request to the platform to provide evidence on so-called transition financing. Because once the corporate community and many member states saw these criteria, they realized, oh dear, we're not green by these definitions. What is the implication of that? And I think there was a wave of concern across corporate Europe. And I mean, this is a positive that people are paying attention, but also it raises genuine and reasonable concerns about access to financing. As someone who understands the process well and who also works for an investor association, we believe that investors will continue to allocate where they can make financial return. So we should all just try and keep this a little bit in perspective. Of course, the purpose of the taxonomy is to help us understand how we improve over time to meet our environmental goals. But nonetheless, the Commission wanted to ask the platform to provide some additional advice on how the taxonomy would support transition finance. Now, we've been asked to provide this advice before mid-March, and that advice will be considered by the Commission before the Delegated Act is finalised. So it's for the Commission, of course, to announce when they will try and introduce the final Delegated Act, but I think it's safe to say it won't be before April. But given, as we know, the obligations for disclosure are meant to start at the start of 2022, looking back on 2021, we don't expect too much delay beyond that.
Yeah. Okay, good to hear. And then you raised the topic of transition here now, and I like to pick up on that on transition activities. So there have been many discussions here as well in Sweden on the transition activities, and especially on bioenergy, which has been heavily discussed. Could you please talk to us or explain a bit what it actually means when an activity is defined as a transition activity?
Yes, I will. I'd like to say something just before I get into the technical part of the Act and the Delegated Act. We've got to remember that the taxonomy sets a performance benchmark that we know with confidence is aligned with our mitigation and adaptation goals. We know with confidence, and it's very important that that benchmark exists in the market. We also know that not all businesses perform at those levels today. So the aim of the taxonomy is to help us identify those companies, those entities that have activities that are performing at those levels, but also the companies that want to improve, that want to change, that want to have environmental goal aligned performance as well. And that's why when we designed the taxonomy, we recognized both turnover from current activities, but also capital expenditures, and if needs be, operational expenditures that go towards improving over time. And actually, I think that's the most important part of the taxonomy for many companies, how you will improve over time. Can you reduce your emissions, bring in technologies, change your practices sufficiently to meet those criteria one day? And if you can, how are you going to do it? Do you need a loan from the bank? Can you issue a bond? What will you spend the money on to get that better performance, and when? And this is the heart of the transition idea. It's really important for the market. In common use, that's what we mean. Expending and investing in our businesses to make them perform better environmentally in future. So that's the common use of the word transition and transition finance. In the regulation, it means something quite precise. And that essentially is a level of environmental performance that we already know is goal aligned, even though it's not zero emissions. And so there's lots of our businesses and our economies that can have very good environmental performance and really make a substantial contribution to our emissions mitigation goals, but they're not yet zero. This is true in hydropower. This is true in even some energy efficient buildings. This is true in forestry and agriculture. So we still want to recognize these activities that are performing at the best possible levels where that performance is consistent with the mitigation goals. And so that's what a transition activity is. It is possible to identify them. They're the ones that aren't zero, or the ones that aren't close to zero. In fact, I should also say there are some that are negative emissions. You know, they're not the transitional ones either, the ones that can abate and store. So that's the way to understand it. And for example, in the energy generation criteria, in the taxonomy, we used 100 grams because we actually modeled energy sector emissions in Europe on a kilowatt hour basis and understood the emissions reduction curve that was going to be necessary in the energy sector to be consistent with the minus 55% target in 2030 and the net zero target in 2050. And of course, we know that there are some other assumptions in there. For example, we know that energy is one of the sectors that will have to get closer to zero first because agriculture is going to be harder. And so with these assumptions and this modeling, you can actually work out what level of emissions is still goal aligned and what's not. And that's how we came up with 100 grams for energy. So that will be called effectively a transitional criteria, and activities performing around that level will probably be called transitional activities, but they're still green. The one, going back to the common use of the term transition, you know, am I improving? Am I expending capital to improve? The taxonomy will recognize any business that's expending or getting a loan to meet those criteria one day. And you can count the CapEx, you can count it, you can get a green loan. You can say to the market, I'm spending to be taxonomy aligned. And investors and banks will love that story. And I think that's really a reassuring message for everyone. But the harder question is when the company cannot meet the criteria. If I run a business that can never meet green criteria, I have a really serious question. Can I improve my performance for, say, a short period of time to reduce the environmental harm? Or is this activity and this technology I'm using ultimately not going to survive a low carbon transition in the economy? And do I need to start thinking about how to move my assets towards retirement? And these are really important transition questions as well. And that Carl Oscar, in a moment, he may want to share, he's trying to work out how to think about these aspects and how we can better identify the decisions that companies are making, so banks and investors know what they're investing in when companies are making those decisions. So I hope that helps.
Definitely. So that definitely helps us think about transition activities and what the term actually means. And so you also mentioned at the start about the importance of trust in the taxonomy from the market. And so how has the Commission ensured that the thresholds in the taxonomy are realistic and science-based?
Yeah, so this is the key moment, isn't it?
Yeah.
Where the credibility of the whole exercise is going to be tested. So the TEG, the technical expert group that you worked on, Matilda, was made up of experts and people from industry and finance. And we actually brought in a lot of people from different sectors as well to advise us. And we had one purpose. We were not making political judgments. We were not thinking about economic questions. We were not thinking about competitiveness questions or trade questions. These are all valid questions. But our job was simply to come up with criteria that were environmentally sound, which we aim to do. Now, of course, when the Commission is finalising the criteria, all of these additional questions come into the mix. Trade questions, economic competitiveness questions, employment questions. It's very difficult to be distinct and clear about when you're prioritising those criteria and when you're prioritising environmental performance criteria. And so this is the challenge for the political institutions in Europe now. And if trade-off decisions are to be made, we hope that they are not in a way that undermines the environmental integrity of the taxonomy. And I'll tell you why this is important, because this is a tool for private markets. It's a tool that's meant to prevent greenwashing. If the tool encourages greenwashing, because we can't distinguish between an economic concern and an environmental performance level, then we've kind of ruined the whole purpose of having this. And if that happens, ultimately the market will develop its own tools to judge environmental performance. And so we're at a key moment. The Commission has been advised by both the TEG and by the JRC and by its environment agencies and by the environment ministries of the different member states, and they are doing their best to make sure that the criteria remain science-based. Where there needs to be some modification to consider local implementation constraints, I'm sure these will be made, and that's reasonable, as long as the overall environmental integrity of the framework is maintained, and that there is ambition to refine and improve the framework over time. Hope that helps.
It really does. It feels very comforting. And then could you give us some insights on what we can expect in the future? So, for example, how often will new delegated acts be released to include more activities? And as I mentioned earlier, we'll have stricter requirements for the different types of activities.
Yes.
Because I can imagine that there's a trade-off here. You would want to have a very flexible taxonomy that can change based on the market conditions, but at the same time, it needs to be comforting for the market with not so many fluctuations.
Yeah, that's right. So already we have 2 delegated acts planned. There's the current one. Then there will be another one, the precise timing of which we're not sure yet. We need to wait for the revised timing after this first one is brought in. And that second delegated act will have economic activities that make a substantial contribution to the next 4 environmental objectives that you mentioned, which will be excellent. And I know that the platform is already working on an additional 70 or so activities that make a substantial contribution, in addition to what we've already got in the mitigation and adaptation side. So that's excellent news for industry, for business, because we're going to be able to identify more as green. And if you don't mind, I'll say that the taxonomy is the best thing that has ever happened to green finance. In the old days, 1 or 2 years ago, we really only thought that wind turbines and renewable energy and a few other limited assets could be suitable for green finance. But we could now be in a situation whereby across 6 environmental objectives and many economic sectors, we're going to have well over 100, 150 possibly different economic activities that can go to the market for green finance. And so this is really a fantastic and positive development. So that second delegated act we need to see, is at the end of this year, is it early next year? I'm not sure yet. And then the next step after that, and the platform contributes, is it to the revision of the taxonomy regulation itself, so to the framework legislation, to see if there needs to be some refinement or change based on everything we've learned through this implementation phase. And that'll give us the opportunity to make a judgment on the regular cycles for introducing new criteria. Okay. Two milestones to note. You mentioned, I think, a potential three-year review for some criteria. That is part of the text in the regulation. But for wherever possible, we'd like to have 5-year timeframes for criteria that are the better performing criteria within that substantial contribution space. So those cycles give you a bit of an indication of the regular review. And we're just working to see how we can include new activities on as fast a basis as possible.
Interesting. We're looking forward to follow all of this work very much. I'll leave you here for now, Nathan. I'm sure that the audience has many questions to you. Thank you very much for your insights. And we will head over to Carl Oskar.
Hello.
Hi, Carl Oskar. Hi. Big thank you to you as well for sharing your insights here today.
It's nice to be here.
Nice to be here. You're working on SEB, but you're also a member of the platform on sustainable finance. And so it's really nice to have you here, just both representing a bank and how you are thinking about the taxonomy, but you also have some really good insights from your work on the platform. So I would like to start with a question to you that's a very broad question, and that is how the taxonomy can act as a tool to steer capital in a sustainable direction.
Well, I think it has actually, the ingredients have already been mentioned today. The fact that taxonomy is providing a common language with definitions of what are activities which have a substantial contribution to sustainable and green economy. That means that we can have consistency. It means that we can have transparency on these issues. And when we have these common definitions and common language, that's when the market can start developing products, labelings that are not greenwashing, but are actually built on evidence and science. And it's also a possibility potentially for the market to really understand, well, when are things maybe, when are they sustainable, but also reducing the risk of what you describe as sustainable. Because today there is a plethora of different definitions. And the problem is, if you go with one, you stand the risk of kind of losing out in the end because the definition was not correct. Now, when we get a common definition, well, you can make sure that you can get a much broader capital going in the same direction, and you stand lower risk of this being wrong. I mean, it's basically no risk at all, and that reduces transaction costs. And when you get reduced transaction costs, low risks, well, then in the end, you might also get a price premium going in that direction. So there are many different parts here. And another part that I think is important to remember is what Nathan alluded to, and that is we are now getting a much broader scope of what are sustainable economic activities. Just a few years ago, we didn't have that. So we kind of in order to be right, we scoped it down or concentrated to a few activities. Now we are basically looking at a broad set of the economy, which has a material impact, but if they perform at a high level, they can be considered sustainable.
It's a very interesting path and journey, and we're on now for sure. And I think there's a lot of movement on the market now, getting prepared for the taxonomy and the implementation of the taxonomy. I think many people are looking towards the bank and how banks will react to this. And how is the banking sector preparing for the implementation of the taxonomy?
Well, maybe I should start with first, I mean, with the kind of where we were about moving capital, because once you have the taxonomy in the common language, not only can the market do products, but the regulators can actually create regulations. And what we're seeing in the market now is that the regulators are really now using the taxonomy to develop, the different areas of regulations that are necessary to move the capital. So we see, for example, the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation that will really make sure that investors are asking their retail investors about, what are their preferences. And earlier, when you asked these things, you couldn't have a common language of talking to them. But now you can say, well, do you want a sustainable fund? Yes, I want that. Well, then you can compare different funds with the same type of parameters, and those regulations are coming. So how is then the banking sector preparing? Well, the banking sector is preparing for all these different kind of regulations, but specifically to the taxonomy, we have been doing quite a lot of work at the European level between the UNEP-FI, the United Nations Environment Programme's Finance Initiative, and the European Banking Federation. So within that group, a lot of banks have come together and looked at how could you actually apply the taxonomy on banking products. And I should say that I think initially in the banking sector, we didn't really believe that this would be a banking taxonomy. It was more designed in the beginning for investors. But as we moved along, we realized, no, this is going to be applied as much on banks as for investors. And then this initiative was created. So now there is a report that have come out from the EBF and UNEP-FI on how to apply, or with guidelines on how to apply the taxonomy on core banking products. And I think those are really excellent to read and to just see how it can be done and what are the challenges in this. But apart from that, the European Banking Federation, they have taxonomy working group. In the Nordic and the Baltic banking associations, we have information sharing about what's going on with the taxonomy and so on. So I think at different levels in Europe, the different organizations are trying to take this in. And then, of course, at each bank, I cannot talk for others, but we're all doing work to integrate this in how we're operating.
Interesting to hear, and indeed, very good report, I think, on the opportunities and challenges for the banking sector. So I can only recommend you to read that. And how will that affect your assessment of corporate clients, and what are your advice to companies in regards to this?
Well, we already started when we got kind of the earlier versions of the what happened now? When we got the earlier versions of the taxonomy, we started to work to integrate the taxonomy in a framework, how to understand a company's transition plans, basically. And that's what we are doing. So we engage now with companies which are having a significant climate impact, which are in these sectors that the taxonomy is pointing out. And we are talking to them about how do you perform today and what are your plans for the future. And this is for us an excellent way of engaging on a strategic level to understand some of the key issues that these companies are facing. And the great thing here, I think, is that the taxonomy is really, it has been developed for the sectors and the activities that have more than 93% of the carbon emissions in Europe. So if you target the companies in these sectors, you have a very good starting point in identifying the most strategic issues. So yes, we are moving in and talking to them, and our main advice is you need to have a plan. And when you develop this plan, you need to look at the taxonomy as one important reference point of what is considered substantial contribution. But of course, this is all different to different sectors and so on. But once you have a plan, there's also something to discuss in relation to how is the market developing, what is the capex needed, and what is your ability to do this transition, and what is your vulnerability to potential regulations and changes in costs and prices in the future, and what kind of products can we provide to you in order to facilitate this movement. So for us, it's kind of a holistic way of discussing with the clients, both on the risk side and on the opportunity side. So how can we basically be your partner in doing this journey?
And that's also really interesting to hear the discussion focusing on transition and the company's plan ahead, and not what's green already now. Thank you very much, Carl-Oskar. Really good insights from the banks. Really appreciate that. I will now hand over the word to Marcus, who I'm sure has picked up many questions from the audience.
Yes, I'm happy to see there's a lot of activity going on here, and Nathan has already answered some of them in short, brief texts, but we have some left. I think one that's worth mentioning and discussing, even if Nathan gave a short one there, is how aligned is this taxonomy to other regulations, directives within the sustainability area within the EU? I don't know who wants to start.
Well, I might be more diplomatic than Carl-Oskar, so why don't I go first, and then he can say what he thinks as a practitioner. I would say not well enough. And I think that's the result of the ideas coming up through the discussion on corporate sustainability disclosure, the idea of fund level disclosure for investors through the SFDR, Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, and the work on taxonomy, all happening in parallel at the same time. And that's a reasonable thing, I think, to expect to happen, because there's a realization that there's genuine urgency here on progressing these reporting frameworks. The one consequence of that is that you have to start to take great care in making sure that all the parts connect and all the concepts align, and that you're not causing duplication or double disclosures with slightly different parameters. Now, I'm happy to say that that work on alignment is happening now in the background. It's happening with the supervisory authorities, it's happening with the Commission, and the platform is even doing some work on that as part of its transition finance response, just to help give a practitioner view on alignment of those concepts. So we're not there yet. There's more work to do here, and we hope to see an improved situation in the next few months.
Great. Thank you, Nathan. Good answer. We're really interesting to hear your view, Carl-Oskar, as a more in it to do it as well, as Nathan was into.
Yeah, well, I mean, I see the practical implications. I mean, if we as a bank are to work with this, we need to have the same definitions of things between the different regulations, the same type of data and information that is required from the companies. And yeah, I can just agree that when you compare them, there are differences at the moment. So I look forward to having more alignment in this area, because the issue is that in the end, we are, as a bank, you have normally also a fund arm, but you also have different parts that are dealing with funds and so on in the bank. And then you're a bank and you need to disclose as a corporate. And, you know, it becomes like a circularity in all this. But and if you have different regulations that are asking for different things in these different areas, suddenly we don't know what to disclose externally, because two different regulations are asking for the same thing, but in a slightly different way. And yeah, that's the problem. But it's always like this when you develop new regulations. You have these kind of the starting years when you need to kind of clean out and get its logic. And I think that's what we're seeing now. So it's not that I think that they are wrong. I just think that this work that is now happening needs to take place, basically.
Mm. Matilda, you speak with a lot of companies. Do you want to add something to this view?
I have nothing to add. I think they spoke very well. I'm looking forward to the work that's being done.
Right. And we see, as Karl-Oskar describes, a lot of, well, I wouldn't say maybe frustration, but just want to get forward faster and get it more clear faster, of course. But it's a lot to do. I was thinking of a lot of. There's one quite concrete about own performance enabling activities and transactional activities. What does that mean for a company that wants to report? If you could.
Yeah, so own activities essentially means what you do, your process, how you produce your products and services. The other main concept is enabling, and that's essentially when what you produce helps somebody else's process. So you might produce some components for energy generation or for manufacture of a car, for example. Yeah, so own performance is really about your core process. So if you're a manufacturer, it's about your manufacturing. If you provide a building, it's about the building function. So I hope that's clear enough.
Mm-hmm. And for some companies, a lot of things, of course, is always not black and white, maybe in practice, but I think it's good enough. I have another one from Anna at SMHI. It's strange to say it in English. Work with weather data in Sweden. Could you share some thoughts on how the flow of capital to climate adaptation and building resilience is helped by the taxonomy? I think that's another view.
Well, maybe I should come in there. I mean, what we have now is we have definitions of both what is significant contribution when it comes to climate mitigation and climate adaptation, which means that when you are making investments that will make your business more resilient, and then it has been defined, well, then you can classify that as significant contribution activities. So just the same as we often talk about mitigation, because there maybe we see a bigger transition journey. Well, it's the same thing here. How do we create a more resilient economy? And what is the transition to a more resilient economy? This has been defined by the taxonomy. So I mean, this goes together. You need to be both resilient to what is going to happen in the future, and you need to reduce your impacts. So if you choose to go in kind of the resilience area, you can show that your company is having a substantial contribution, as long as you do not do significant harm to the other 5 environmental objectives. So this also opens up a whole new kind of pathway for areas that can be considered environmentally sustainable that was not before. And I think that is important. We didn't really have that as a category before when we looked at sustainable economic activities. So this is another part, where the scope has widened in a way.
Great. Thank you, Karl-Oskar, for that. We were into this regulation thing. We had a little longer here, and I think Nathan described it, but just to elaborate a little bit more on that. Are the standards being developed on 100% scientific basis, and then comes to regulations, or how is that really? We said were they aligned or not, but have different angles on how we started this.
Yes, I think the answer is yes. The intention was to always use evidence in the justification. For example, there was no assumption that we should simply start with existing industry-based EU regulations. So at the risk of being controversial, the Common Agricultural Policy does not have sufficient requirements for agricultural practices that are aligned with our future emissions reduction needs in agriculture. This is simply a fact of life. In fact, I'll make it even plainer. We would not need a Green Deal if our existing regulations meant that we were going to reduce emissions sufficiently. The whole reason there's a Green Deal is because we're not where we need to be. So there was no, we obviously couldn't just start from the regulations that were there. So we tried to set criteria that reflected the future emissions reduction needs, so the new targets. So we actually worked on minus 50% by 2030, which is extending to a more ambitious target, and the net zero 2050. And then we modeled and looked at practices in the different sectors. So there's a slightly longer answer to a short answer, which is, yeah, we started with the science.
Yeah, it's not always that easy as it sounds. What is science? At least in Sweden, we know that about bioenergy, and that discussion it's quite hard.
Yes, that's an interesting one. Yes, and I think, I mean, well, I know you don't want to spend too much time talking about specific criteria, but I think there is recognition that even the RED II annexes are going to need to be updated at some time in future. So then it becomes a question of, well, how are we going to implement this change? Do we follow RED II for now for the taxonomy and then go through the revision of RED II and rely on that to provide the new criteria? Or do we set the new criteria now to try and start to provide some capital to the forestry sector, where the sector says, sure, we'll start to plan for improvements. And then the banks and the investors will start to invest in the improvements that need to be made. So we need to think a bit more broadly here about what we're ultimately trying to achieve, and that is to bring private capital in to sectors that are improving. That's really what we're trying to do.
Yeah, that's great. So, Matilda, yes, we have one question here, as I asked the last one to on the poll. How much will you be affected by the taxonomy? So while you're answering that, I would like to ask you, Matilda, if you're an organization here and you see that this will probably affect you quite well, how should you start in this area when a lot is in place, but a lot is not yet in place? Where should you start?
Well, you start with an initial understanding of the taxonomy, and there is already a lot of good resources to take from here. There's the TEG report, which we have to be aware that the criteria in the TEG report are not the most current ones, but it gives a great understanding of the design of the taxonomy and the reasoning behind the sector criteria. And then, of course, there's the YouTube series from Climate Bond Initiative. I also have to mention, I think has been really good. It's a YouTube series with the TEG group, where they, again, the criteria is not the most updated ones, but it gives a really good understanding of the reasoning behind transition activities and the criteria you set, for example. You should look at the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation and the Non-Financial Reporting Directive and assess whether you have to report. And then you start screening your activities and look at how taxonomy aligned your organization or your fund, for example, is. But also for companies that don't have to disclose, taxonomy provides a great opportunity to take strategic decisions and really define your journey ahead in regards to a net zero economy 2050. So I think it's really about doing a risk and opportunity assessment of how the taxonomy might affect you, besides from disclosing and how you can use the taxonomy to move ahead.
Great. Thank you, Matilda. And time flies when you discuss this interesting issues. Great thanks to Nathan and Carl-Oskar for joining us. Thank and you. All other joining us. And not too surprising, most of you are being affected by the taxonomy of seas. With this audience and this team, that would be a surprise if it were not, maybe. So almost half of you is affected, and 1/3, or a little bit more even, are affected very much. Oh, I needed to press it twice. Sorry, share results. So now you can see it as well. Sorry for that. And thanks for this. And as you know, the delegated acts aren't set yet, but we hope to have more roundtable discussions around that. So we get back to you. And if you're interested in that, joining, please send an email to us. Don't hesitate to contact, of course, if there's any other things. There's a lot to discuss here. And with that, have a nice end of the Friday and happy weekend to all of you. Thanks for today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.